Guys, the Lumix S1R2 and the Nikon Z8 are both incredible hybrid cameras, and I'm going to talk about their video capabilities later on in this video. But primarily as a photographer by trade, I am so excited to put both of these cameras to the test because today I'm using both of them on a real campaign. I just kind of like this angle. It's like a Beastie Boys camera comparison, camera comparison. Yeah, it's kind of cool. That was cringe. Apologies for the mess. I am currently moving. I probably could have cleaned up instead of lighting this scene for about 30 minutes, but you know, priorities. In this video, we're gonna go over a bunch of important categories in both cameras, compare them. I'm gonna tell you what I think is best for me, and I'm gonna show you some of my results and let you decide what you think would be best for yourself. I like this LUT cam. It's very cam-esque. Okay, now both these cameras give you the ability to make a LUT or an image recipe in camera or on your computer. With the Nikon, you're gonna have to use their editing software or their image cloud software, whereas the Lumix, you can use whatever you really want to make a cube file. You could even do that directly in Photoshop. I think I'm gonna use it on the shoot, but then of course, go into the RAWs and actually change the color. It's nice to see some sort of finished look as you're shooting, especially when you adjust your final RAW files so much. It's nice to just have something that looks like what it might look like at the end. I believe I'm gonna use the one that Cam made. Pretty stoked on it, looks pretty good. But now I need to make one on the Nikon. Now something that both of these cameras do is they give you a lot of control with these looks, and the pre-made looks are all way too strong. But when you start toning things down with these is really when you can get into the magic. And I don't frequently shoot like this, but I've been getting into it more because it just helps you visualize your finished product and it makes your photos that much better. So I'm gonna go through the settings and see if I can't make one that I like with the Z8. Now, both these cameras did a totally fine job at creating something that helped me visualize my end goal. I will say I liked the Lumix's look a little bit better, but that's due to Cam probably taking a lot more time to create that LUT than I did with the Nikon, just using the in-camera controls. A couple differences I found in these cameras in this category is, I will say something I've noticed with the Lumix is the preview when you have a LUT on takes a lot longer to pull up than a preview on this. This is much, much snappier. Now I will say take that information with a grain of salt because the Lumix was generating JPEGs and the Nikon was not. However, they're both using the same speed USH2 SD card. Something that the Nikon did that the Lumix didn't that I thought was pretty interesting is it applied the edits that I had made on camera to the RAWs in Lightroom. This is a feature I personally probably wouldn't use, but I can see it being nice for a lot of photographers. Have you seen JoJo's Bizarre Adventure?
No, but I know what you're talking about.
Like extreme angle. Yo! Okay, before we go into the photo shoot, let's go over our specs. Now, these two cameras are pretty interesting, and I think the reason why a lot of people want them compared is because on paper, they're pretty similar. There's no way I'm gonna remember all these specs, so I'm just gonna read them. Nikon, 45 megapixel full frame CMOS sensor, 30 frames a second continuous RAW photos, sensor shift 5-axis stabilization up to 6 stops of dynamic range, electronic shutter only, no mechanical shutter, a 2.1 million dot display that's 2 by 3 inches, and of course the mount is Z mount. Okay, for the Lumix S1R2, we have a 44.3 full frame megapixel CMOS not stacked sensor. We have up to 40 FPS continuous RAW photos in electronic shutter mode. This camera does have a mechanical shutter, but you cannot get those high frame rates unless you're an electronic shutter. This also has 5-axis stabilization sensor shift technology. This one is up to 8 stops of dynamic range. And this also has a 3 by 2 inch screen that is only 1.84 million dots instead of the 2.1. So while they are different sensors and they do give slightly different results, when it comes to photography, your image quality is essentially the same. That just puts more emphasis on the other parts of the camera to determine which one you would actually want to use more. Now, since on paper their image quality is essentially identical, I think the best option is to just put the process files up on the screen and let you decide for yourself which one you think you prefer. Okay, so I've got both cameras now set up with flash control, so that one works, and that one works. hopefully by looking at those, you're able to get some idea of how the cameras function. Both of these cameras have great image quality. I'd say they're easily past the threshold of usability for a professional, but I did notice a couple of differences. Now, keep in mind, when you get into this nitpicking of color, it gets subjective. Here are a couple of my subjective observations. As a whole, talking about the base RAW files with no real color applied, the Nikon has a slightly more neutral, less saturated file. The Lumix seems to lean a tad bit more saturated, a tad bit warmer. Personally, with the way that I like to edit, I do actually prefer the Nikon image quality, although it is so incredibly close and I can adjust my edit in the very minor amount to make the raw files essentially feel equal. So as a lot of the stuff with these two cameras comes down to, it is a point of personal preference. Nikon's gonna give you just a slightly more clean slate to start with, where Lumix is already stylized just a little bit and, in my opinion, in a good direction. But I wouldn't make any decisions based off image quality because they're so similar. I will say the stacked sensor on the Nikon technically gives it less dynamic range, although I had a hard time noticing that at all. So sick.
Oh, I love that one. Wait, that one was so good.
Okay, let's talk autofocus. Both these cameras did a good job. And like in a lot of the other categories, I will say for professional level photography, they exceeded the bar needed. You know, they are both past good enough. I will give the edge in this case to the Nikon though. While the Lumix was snappy, the Nikon was snappier. While the Lumix was able to track eyes, the Nikon was stickier. And I would say that if I wasn't comparing these directly next to each other, I wouldn't necessarily notice that big of a difference. But the Nikon really exceeded my expectation. So I'm gonna have to give autofocus to them. Still, I think underrated in terms of autofocus. It's so snappy, so sticky. It's getting to the point where it's coming close to Sony as far as how good the autofocus is. Sony still far and away has some magical autofocus. But no, the Nikon, the Z8, very, very good.
We are using my light up high on a C-stand. We're doing like a twin style shot with this as the background. Kind of like hauntingly beautiful in a way. Oh, and both cameras we're using the 40mm and the 50mm respectively.
Let's talk about lens options. First off, the Lumix S1R2 is part of the L-mount Alliance. This is a group of lens manufacturers and camera brands that have all decided, hey, it benefits all of us to have the same mount and to make lenses that work for each other's cameras. This is Leica, Lumix, Sigma, and a bunch of others. The selection for L-mount is not complete yet, but the speed and momentum at which they are coming out with new amazing lenses that are cheaper because there are so many people making lenses for this mount, it's very fast. So when I see L-mount as the ecosystem, I see that as a plus. You go over to Nikon and you see Z-mount. Now Nikon has done a fantastic job of providing their own full-frame lenses and plenty of really good options there. When you start looking for cheaper alternative options other than the very expensive full-frame glass that Nikon makes, you run into a very limited amount. There are really only a few, and while it looks like they are slowly opening up their mount to third-party lenses, they're being very specific with who they let do it, and it just doesn't seem like that's something that they're that interested in. I have to say that's always disappointing to see. Some of my favorite lenses are Sigma lenses, and when I'm looking at camera bodies to buy, good third-party options is a huge plus because lenses are incredibly expensive, and first-party options are sometimes double or even triple the amount that the third-party options cost. Nowadays, third-party glass is incredibly good. So for lens ecosystem, it's easily going to go to the Lumix S1R2 for being part of the L-mount Alliance and just the bright future of amazing glass that will bring you.
So I've been going back and forth with the cameras. This one I've got this 35 to 150 lens so I can get more individual shots. The other one's kind of stuck with the ultra wide because we keep using that lens because it's sick.
Okay, let's talk about design and handling. This, in my opinion, is the most important part of this comparison because the cameras are again so similar and both so incredibly good. Both cameras have a traditional modern mirrorless design with a good sized grip and plenty of dials and buttons. One of the immediate differences I noticed is the Z8 is a little bit chunky compared to the S1R2. For me, I prefer the Z8 size, it just fits my hand better. And the S1R2 reminds me of holding like some of the earlier A7 series cameras. It's that more traditional style of body. The design language from Nikon really shows through the whole body of the camera, and it feels cohesive with the lenses. The whole thing feels very like kind of like an Apple ecosystem where it just feels like one cohesive design. And for me, the S1R2 kind of feels more on the Android side of design. Feels like more of a generic type camera body, and it takes a lot of good designs from other camera manufacturers and implements them. So you end up with a lot of these features from other cameras that are put together in a very useful way, but in my personal opinion, it just doesn't feel as good to use. The S1R2 definitely wins on screen maneuverability. It has the full tilty flippy that the A7R5 has. It's just the best way to have a screen on the back of a camera. You can flip it all the way around, you can tilt it in every which direction. It's great. The Nikon Z8 screen is good, but you can't flip it all the way around, so you can't see yourself while you're filming if you don't have a monitor. Battery-wise, it seems like the Nikon lasts a bit longer than the S1R2. For me, a lot of this comes down to personal preference, but just button placement and menus and how all that functions, I really do prefer the Nikon camera. However, they're both very customizable, and it looks like the S1R2 you can really get in there and customize those buttons to be however you want them to be. Again, it's such a subjective category, but for me, I'm gonna give it handily to the Nikon in the design category.
That's so sick.
But he can still make himself useful.
Sweet.
All right, this review is not entirely about video, but I do want to go over the features because it's so important. These are hybrid cameras. Their photo capability is amazing, but what makes them truly amazing is that they can do both photo and video really well. Now, if you want to get like a super in-depth comparison, I would check out Cam Mackey's YouTube channel. If it's not out already, I think he's coming out with a camera comparison really soon. I've got my laptop out because I don't want to get anything wrong. We've gone over the basic specifications, but I want to touch on some video ones specifically. Both these cameras have RAW options, which is crazy. The S1R2 has ProRes RAW and the Nikon has NRAW. Both these cameras shoot up to 8K, which is just, I don't know. In my opinion, how often do you actually need to shoot 8K? It's cool that it can do it, but you're not going to end up actually using that in practice. The S1R2 has open gate, where the Nikon does not. Open gate is a huge benefit in my opinion. Being able to record in that more squarish format allows you a lot more flexibility in post for cropping for social media. Very nice to have for a lot of reasons. It also helps with anamorphic. They both have HDMI, they both have microphone jacks. A lot of your basic necessities for a camera that can do video proficiently are on both of these cameras. I really do think you can't go wrong with either of these cameras for video, but what I will say, having used both for video, the S1R2 has a lot of specialty features that other camera manufacturers just don't really have for video, such as like anamorphic in-body stabilization. Very niche feature, but if you use anamorphic lenses, it's super important to have. Things like open gate, de-stretch, things like that are, in my opinion, due to the fact that Lumix is not really one of those top 3 camera companies. So they're coming at this as a bit of an underdog. And what that tends to lead to is a company like really listening to their niche customers. And in this case, it's people who really have found a focus with video shooting. The big difference between these cameras with video is going to be all those specialized features that the S1R2 has for specifically video creators. And because of that, I think the S1R2 has the edge on video over the Z8. I do want to mention it's important to remember that Nikon has bought Red Cinema cameras, and they may be implementing more and more video features coming up, but I don't think it's a great idea to ever buy anything based on possible future updates.
So we just wrapped. It's a little bit later than we thought, but I shot with these cameras back and forth all day, and I have some thoughts. Let's do it.
If I were to see both cameras on the table and somebody told me you can have one of these for free, I would pick the Nikon Z8 over the Lumix S1R2. And I think it comes down to a couple things for me. The handling in the autofocus is so important, and I just don't shoot enough video with the specific features that the Lumix gives you that are really important. I'm not shooting anamorphic that often. Open gate is pretty nice, but the Nikon, when I'm shooting it, it just truly like sparks joy when I'm taking photos, where the Lumix just doesn't. I think it's that simple for me. If you were buying these and I was to give you advice, I truly would have a hard time recommending the Nikon over the Lumix just based on price. Something we didn't really touch on is the Lumix is around $2,000, I believe.
No, you idiot. I'm editing this video right now and I go on about the price and how the Lumix is like half the price of the Nikon. That's not true. Looking at the prices, the Nikon has been on sale for like almost exactly the same price as the S1R2. The S1R2 is like $3,200. The Nikon has been like $600 off for a bit because I think honestly they want the pricing to be competitive. Essentially, they are pretty much the same price. I go on to say I would recommend the Lumix for the price difference. I don't think that's the case. I don't know if Nikon's going to let that be the case. I think they're going to continue to be price competitive. So recommending to buy, the value is about the same, better depending on which way you lean preference-wise.
I think an easy recommendation is if you are primarily a video shooter who takes photos, get the Lumix. If you are primarily a photo shooter that takes videos, get the Nikon. Oh, something I hadn't mentioned during my segment on the lenses. The Nikon has an edge versus the L-mount Alliance in one way. The flange distance, that means how far the back glass is to the sensor on the Nikon cameras, is the smallest. And any mount that has a longer flange distance, which for Nikon is all the other mounts, can be adapted onto the camera. I made a video about an E-mount adapter for the Nikon cameras that is fantastic, and it gives you autofocus. It is fully usable and like not intrusive at all. But that is an edge that the Nikon has as far as lens options. Because if you're willing to adapt, you have a huge amount of lenses opened up to you. I think that's it. If you enjoyed this video and you got something out of it, please subscribe, continue watching my videos. I would appreciate it greatly. If you don't want to, bye forever. That felt good.